In Arthur, we find a mirror of Celtic kingship. Yet the odd truth is that there is no firm proof the historical Arthur was a crowned ruler at all. The figure who strides through legend is a tapestry woven from many heroic and royal strands. Celtic storytelling holds three great cycles of hero tales. Two are Irish: the Ulster cycle of Conchobar and the champion Cu Chulainn, and the Fenian or Ossianic cycle of Fionn mac Cumhail and his warrior poet son Oisin. The third is the Arthurian cycle, born in the Brythonic world. If the real Arthur drew his first breath in Cornwall at wind-swept Tintagel, the earliest stories grew in Wales and then crossed with refugees to Brittany, so all three Brythonic lands can claim a share. From Brittany, the legends reached Norman courts and then radiated outward. Countless writers mined these materials, but four voices fixed Arthur in the imagination of Europe. The Welsh chronicler Nennius named him in the 9th century. In the 12th, Geoffrey of Monmouth blended history and marvels into a runaway bestseller that set the stage. Soon after, Chrétien de Troyes in Champagne carried the tales into French romance, launching the Grail tradition. Centuries later, Sir Thomas Malory shaped the sprawling cycle into a single great English book, Le Morte d'Arthur, published by William Caxton in 1485. By Malory's time, the saga had swollen into a vast web of episodes and characters, what later ages called the Matter of Britain. Even people who never cracked the old books know the names Lancelot and Guinevere, the Lady of the Lake, the Sword in the Stone. To make sense of the themes that matter, it helps to sketch the story's main arc. Arthur is fathered by Uther Pendragon, warlord of Britain. At odds with the Cornish Duke Gorlois, Uther takes the duke's stronghold and, through Merlin's arts, comes to the bed of Gorlois's widow Igraine, begetting Arthur. Igraine's daughter Morgan grows into a formidable enchantress, later known as Morgan le Fay. Merlin spirits the newborn away to be raised in secrecy by Sir Ector, alongside Ector's son, Kay, who will become Arthur's sharp-tongued but steadfast seneschal. After Uther dies, Britain fractures. At Christmas in London, the Archbishop gathers the nobles at Merlin's urging. A sword stands fixed in an anvil on a stone, its golden inscription promising the crown to whoever draws it free. In a scramble to fetch a weapon for Kay, the foster son Arthur idly pulls the blade and does what no lord can repeat. Merlin names him rightful ruler, and the realm bows. In youth, Arthur commits a sin that will return to destroy him, lying with his aunt Margause and fathering Modred. He later weds Guinevere, daughter of King Leodegrance, who brings as dowry a round table that will embody the ideal of equality among Arthur's chosen. Camelot becomes the heart of his court. After the wedding, Merlin falls captive to the charms of a young sorceress, Nineveh, and vanishes into enchantment beneath the Cornish cliffs. Margause marries King Lot of Orkney, a rebel against Arthur. Their sons Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth will one day sit at the round table. Lot is killed by King Pellinore, ally to Arthur and tireless hunter of the questing beast, and Gawain takes vengeance on Pellinore. From France arrives Lancelot, son of King Ban, Maid Queen's champion and doomed to love Guinevere. Under enchantment he lies with Elaine, begetting Galahad, the purest of knights, then falls into long madness under the weight of passion and jealousy. Arthur's reign becomes a tapestry of marvels and trials. He sends his companions to chase the monstrous boar Twerk Traith, whose bristling mane hides a jeweled comb and shears. He then proclaims a higher calling, the search for the Grail, the holy cup of Christ's passion. The vision appears for a moment in the hall, and the company rides out. Galahad takes the perilous empty seat at the table, and alone sees the Grail entire. Percival, raised deep in the Welsh woods by a mother who kept him innocent even of his own name, glimpses mysteries but fails to ask their meaning until later lessons temper him. At the heart of these tales lies the Fisher King, a guardian of the Grail wounded through the thighs, whose pain wastes his land until the right question is asked. Arthur's enemies fall before him in war after war. Among the most famous lovers in his world stand Tristram of Lyonesse and Iseult the Fair, bound by a fateful potion and pursued by the jealous King Mark of Cornwall, their graves later twined by a single living tree. Meanwhile, Lancelot and Guinevere's secret burns too brightly to hide. Modred exposes them, the fellowship fractures, and in the civil struggle, Lancelot kills Gareth and Gaheris, and later mortally wounds Gawain. Exiled to France, he breaks sieges as the Round Table collapses. Modred then reaches for the crown and seeks to wed the queen. Guinevere flees to a convent. Arthur sails home, meets his son in battle, kills him, and receives a mortal wound in that same clash. He commands his loyal Bedivere to return Excalibur to the water. Twice the knight falters. The third time the blade arcs out, and a hand rises from the lake to take it. Lancelot returns too late, takes holy orders, and dies soon after Guinevere. Arthur, borne by a company of queens across the western waters to Avalon, passes into the Isles of the Blessed. The epitaph hails him as the once and future king, and folk memory keeps him sleeping beneath the hills, ready to rise at the nation's direst hour. All this is glorious poetry and moral architecture, but was there a real Arthur beneath it? Britain in the early 6th century was a Christian Romano-Celtic land, battered by heathen invaders from across the sea. For a generation or so, roughly from the late teens of the 500s to about the 540s, the advance of the Anglo-Saxons appears to have been checked. Tradition gives the credit to a single commander named Arthur. Absolute proof is missing, but the balance of scholarship now leans toward a real leader whose victories seeded the legend. What kind of leader was he? Nennius, the earliest writer to name him, calls him a war commander and a protector of the Britons. Those titles can mean many things, from battlefield captain to national guardian, but both point to a role above tribal rank. Skeptics note that no tribe is attached to his name, and that the battle list scattered across Britain looks more like folklore than a campaign map. Yet in a land with many local kings, a roaming field commander who joined local levies to a corps of elite riders makes perfect sense. Winston Churchill once observed that a small mobile force of armored cavalry could dance around Saxon infantry and win again and again. The very kinship between cavalry and chivalry is stamped into the words themselves. Nennius names 12 battles, the first at the mouth of a river called Glyndwr, 4 along a river called Dubglas in a district named Linuis, another by a river named Bassas, 1 in the Caledonian Wood, 1 at a fort called Guinon, 1 in the city of the Legion, which later ages identify with Caerleon on the Usk, another on the banks of the Tribruit, 1 on a hill called Agned, the last most famous on Mount Baden, where, so the tale runs, hundreds fell in a single charge. Scholars have argued for modern sites from Lincolnshire to Scotland, from Bath and Badbury to Dorset Hillforts. Gildas places Baden in the year of his birth around 517, and Camlan, the fatal clash with Modred, is often dated about 538. Between those points stretches a span of peace long enough to glow in memory as a golden age. Names themselves muddy the water. Arthur likely comes from a Latin form related to the word for bear, while a Brythonic war god known as Bran bore the epithet Ardu, the Dark One, a likeness of sound that may have drawn divine attributes toward a human champion. Before the 6th century, no native Briton is recorded with the name Arthur. By its end, it is everywhere, even among princes in Argyll. That pattern hints at one towering original whose fame made the name desirable. If any place on the map looks like Camelot stripped of glamour and reduced to earth and timber, it is South Cadbury in Somerset. The hill rises above the levels west of Glastonbury. 4 massive ramparts ring a summit large enough for a royal hall. Excavations have revealed occupation from pre-Roman days, through the Roman period, and on into the 6th century, with signs of major fortification exactly in Arthur's supposed time. If not his work, then the work of someone very much like him. Geoffrey of Monmouth's sweeping history of the kings of Britain gave later storytellers vivid scenes and bold claims. He loves precise march orders and genealogies that often dissolve under scrutiny. He insists he had an old British book in his hands and drew on a wide reading of Latin authors. However fanciful his showpieces, odd shafts of light keep piercing the fog. He insists, for instance, that mighty stones were hauled from far away to build a great ring on Salisbury Plain. Modern archaeology has shown that Stonehenge's inner bluestones did indeed travel over land and sea from the mountains of western Britain. In the end, that is how Arthur's world often feels. A long bridge of song thrown between islands of fact, with enough of the piers still standing to make us believe someone once truly marched across. What, if anything, does Geoffrey actually tell us about a historical Arthur? He is the first to spin the tale of Merlin aiding Uther Pendragon in deceiving Igraine, the Cornish duke's wife, which raises the possibility that Arthur's birth belongs to Cornwall. Tintagel's headland, almost an island and defended by sea and cliff, fits the bill for a 6th century stronghold. Later excavations uncovered Norman-era defenses and much older monastic traces, and local lore still points to the sea cave below as Merlin's prison. Early Welsh texts also hint at a Cornish childhood. They name Arthur's boyhood home as Kellywick, a Cornish term for woodgrove, recorded as an earlier name for Collington between Liskeard and Launceston. By contrast, early Norman French writers say Arthur's homeland is Logres, a word derived from the Welsh name for England, suggesting that even Welsh tradition did not originally claim him as a native son of Wales. By modern standards, Geoffrey's narrative is oddly lopsided. He spends a great swath of pages on Arthur, then ushers him off stage almost casually. One moment, Arthur is carving a path of victories. A few lines later, he is mortally wounded and ferried to Avalon to be healed. Geoffrey adds that Arthur surrendered the crown to his kinsman Constantine, son of Cador of Cornwall, in the year 542. That is the last we hear of him. The name Constantine was common among rulers, prized since the emperor who adopted the Chi-Rho after a vision of a flaming cross. In the Brythonic world, the name carried the weight of fidelity to the Christian faith. Cornwall still has a parish called Constantine. Even if Geoffrey embroidered the scene of a dying Arthur naming a successor, the detail aligns with other clues that Arthur was a Christian commander. Gildas, quoted by Nennius, says that at Badon Arthur carried the cross of our Lord for 3 days and nights. Whether this means a literal wooden cross borne in ritual or a figurative banner of the faith, the implication is plain enough. Curiously, several early saints' lives cast Arthur as an adversary of monasteries. In the life of Cadoc, he demands cattle from the abbey at Lancarfan and is thwarted by miracle. In the life of Padarn, he is punished for attempted theft. In the life of Caranog, he even steals an altar and returns it only after the saint helps him slay a dragon. The likely truth, as Geoffrey Ashe notes, is prosaic. A war leader requisitioned church goods for his army, and the monks remembered him chiefly as a demanding visitor. These texts are also the first to call him king, but the sense is probably that of a local sovereign rather than a crowned ruler of all Britain. Arthur's death mattered intensely in the 12th century. Henry II, who claimed a line back to Arthur, had every reason to insist that the hero was truly dead rather than a hidden champion destined to return. A Welsh poem from the 10th century foretold the coming back of ancient leaders to unite the Britons and drive the English into the sea. In Cornwall, tempers could flare over the assertion that Arthur still lived. Even today, the Cornish Gorsedd sings that he is not dead, but will come again. For Brittonic peoples, Arthur became the emblem of national spirit. To deny his life was to dim the nations themselves. Eager to settle the matter, Henry announced that a Welsh bard had revealed Arthur's tomb at Glastonbury. In 1190, the monks proclaimed they had uncovered a grave marked by a stone and an inscribed cross naming Arthur on the Isle of Avalon, with a tall man's bones alongside those of a woman with golden hair. Many visitors accept the site to this day. Whether this was truth, credulous error, or clever fundraising remains impossible to prove. Richard I later produced a sword he touted as Excalibur and gifted it abroad. Whatever the facts, Arthur's legend had grown so potent that kings felt compelled to harness it. Measured against the expectations of early Celtic rulership, the legendary Arthur fits the mold. Unblemished body, imposing stature, mastery in war, fearless courage, a gift for right speech and straight dealing, reverence for natural law, a fierce sense of honor, and refinement in noble arts from strategy to formal games. To these traits, the story adds Roman virtues of statecraft, mobile tactics, and cavalry command, and, in its Christianized form, devotion, resistance to heathenism, compassion and humility, reverence for mothers and for women of every station, and loyalty to a higher cause even at great personal cost. Folded together, these strands produce the medieval ideal of chivalry. Yet the moral core remains recognizably Celtic. Much in the cycle reaches back to older tales. Arthur's hunt of Turktraeth echoes Irish stories of a king turned into a boar. Arthur and Finn both meet giants, underworld lords, and shapeshifters. The famous English poem about Gawain and the Green Knight stands beside Irish beheading games rooted in head-taking cults. Tristan and Isolde's fate mirrors the pursuit of Diomed and Graun. Some elements are more elusive. Morgan Le Fay's name looks not to the Irish battle queen, but to the sea and birth, and medieval writers often call her a goddess presiding over a blessed apple isle, one of many echoes of Celtic goddesses, rather than a single fixed original. Again and again the stories circle Celtic laws of hospitality and fair dealing. Guests are promised meat for their hounds, corn for their horses, rich cuts and overflowing cups, a bed and song. Many of Arthur's companions wear the names of gods recast as heroes, such as Mabon, son of Modron, Manawydan, son of Lir, and Lugh of the Long Hand under a Welsh guise. The bright islands and glass castles belong to a world where youth never fades and feasts never end, the Brythonic Avalon and the Goidelic land of the ever-young. In one Welsh poem, Arthur sails in his ship to seize a cauldron wrought with pearls and stoked by 9 maidens' breath. a vessel that refuses to cook for cowards. However much later poets draped the Grail in Christian glory, beneath it lies the pagan vessel of plenty. The otherworld in Celtic thought is near at hand, endlessly alluring and therefore perilous. Heroes slip into forests, islands, and crystal halls, wrestle with marvels, and return changed. Time stops there. Death does not rule. The hero's strength is to cross that threshold and come back. The deeper root is shamanic, the holy traveler who descends, intercedes, and returns. In such a world, unusual births mark unusual destiny. Celtic tales teem with children conceived in rape, deception, or divine embrace, then fostered away so their power can ripen. Even saints arrive under marvels. Arthur's birth through Uther's deception of Igraine follows the same pattern. For Celts, such beginnings unlock the fierce energy a true champion needs to do what ordinary lives cannot. Medieval scribes who set the Arthurian tales down on vellum struggled with their pagan frankness about sex. They elevated Percival's virginity into a moral centerpiece, and much of the later cycle reads like earthy Celtic vigor, wrapped in a new cloak of Christian abstinence and purity. The late-arriving questing beast is almost a sermon in allegory. A princess tempts her brother, the devil sires her child, hounds devour the brother, and the princess bears a chimera stitched from many beasts, its belly forever echoing with the yelps of the pack. A fantasia of incest anxiety. For a ruler, sexuality is not a private matter but a symbol of sovereignty. The king is imagined as wedded to the land itself. Many Celtic tales test that power through signs of overwhelming desire. In some versions, Modred spreads false news of Arthur's death in France. While Glyndwr mourns, the nobles insist she must marry Modred at once. Modred's craving is more than lust. It is the appetite of kingship seeking union with the realm personified by the queen. His birth is placed on May Day, aligning him with the young sun god and, by contrast, casting Arthur as the autumnal or father figure. Seen this way, the triangle of Arthur, Lancelot, and Glyndwr is not only a gripping human drama, it reenacts a very old pattern. The ever-renewing goddess who is the land bears a son who grows to manhood, supplants the father, and renews fertility. The kingdom's collapse after Arthur's death is mythic as much as political. The bell-like successor cannot possess the queen, who embodies Britain, and so the cycle stalls. The tale in which Melwys abducts Glyndwr and Arthur rescues her mirrors the Persephone story. Carrying the celebrated virtues of chivalry also reach back to deeper Celtic roots. Courage, liberality, truthfulness, loyalty, courtesy, and honor appear again and again, and behind them stands the druidic conviction that right speech carries sacred force. Hence the vows, oaths, and public undertakings that structure the romances are more than narrative devices. They preserve an older reverence for the binding word. The ethic endures into history. After Poitiers in 1356, the captured French king John II returned voluntarily to English captivity when his son broke parole, choosing honor over freedom. Even the word parole itself, one's word, preserves that lineage. Celtic fosterage, grounded in spoken bonds, fed the same ideal. Arthur drawing the sword from the stone echoes another island tradition. The Lia File, the stone of destiny, was said to cry out only beneath the true High King of Ireland. Legend tells that it later became the Stone of Scone, carried to Westminster and kept beneath the coronation chair, spirited away by Scottish students in 1950, recovered, and ultimately returned to Edinburgh. Irish tradition counters that the original never left Ireland. Either way, the theme is the same: a sacred test that reveals the rightful ruler. The fixation on head wounds and decapitations that runs through Arthurian storytelling is straight from Celtic belief. The head was the seat of the self. Trophy heads hung in shrines. Heroes were undone by old skull wounds reopening. Arthur is said to die of a head blow. The Glastonbury monks, eager to prove they had found his grave, pointed to a deep cut in the skull. Gawain, too, even wielding Excalibur against Lancelot, later falls when a healed wound bursts. The gruesome relish of beheading in early vernacular tales persists in the romances for a reason. It matches an ancient cult of the head. Gawain himself is sometimes named Arthur's heir in place of Modred, reflecting a real Celtic custom in which a sister's son could be the favored successor. His name has been traced to Hawk of May, and in legend his strength swells toward noon like the sun and fades thereafter, another hint of a solar hero. The famous tale of the Green Knight begins on New Year's Day, when the Emerald Challenger demands a single stroke now for a return stroke in a year and a day. Gawain cleaves off the head. The body coolly retrieves it and rides away, and Gawain keeps his appointment. He resists seduction, accepts only a green sash, and receives merely a nick, his small fault marked in his flesh. The scene feels steeped in Christian morality, yet its bones are older. The beheading game and the covenant of the returned blow are found in earlier Celtic stories, where the challenger hails from the other world and the prize is valor rather than chastity. Even the perilous seat at the round table, which seems unmistakably Christian, likely stands above older ground. The table evokes the whole world and the shared meal of the Last Supper, with one seat left open for a soul of absolute purity. Fill the traitor's place with a saint, and the circle is healed. But circles of people signifying harmony long predate the romances. The stone rings of Britain and Ireland remain as witnesses, and druidic rites likely arranged bodies in a ring to enact cosmic order. Modern Celtic bardic gatherings still form the Great Circle. Merlin, too, wears layers. Behind Geoffrey's enchanter lies the figure called Myrddin, a bard and seer linked to a border battle, driven mad by slaughter, wandering the forest of the lowlands as a wild prophet. A poignant poem laments his solitude among apple trees and his longing for death. From such fragments grew the wizard who guides kings, dwells backward in time, or endures in enchanted stasis, a mythic vessel carrying both grief and insight. The Arthurian imagination has shaped centuries. A Tudor king christened his heir Arthur at Winchester to summon a golden age. Fate sent Henry VIII instead, who in his way echoed parts of the legend. No English monarch has since claimed the name, perhaps because it bears too much promise. Of the man behind the myth we still know little. Of the myth's reach we know much. It has turned a shadowy war leader into a symbol of tragic greatness, and a moral horizon for a culture renewed in every age. As with Arthur, peeling myth away from history in early Ireland is tricky work. When you look for the first line of High Kings, even choosing a starting point is contentious. Braes, the beautiful, the mixed-blood stand-in for Nuada after the loss of his arm, belongs to legend. So, most likely, does Eramon, one of the Milesian leaders who, in story, defeats his brother Aberfinn and becomes the first supreme ruler of the island. A long roll of Milesian high kings follows, their historicity hazy. Tigernmas, seventh of the line, is credited with smelting gold and popularizing gold ornaments. Farther along comes Olam Fodla, remembered as a poet-seer and praised for inaugurating the Great Assembly at Tara where the High King was affirmed. That festival symbolized a ritual union of ruler and land, an idea that surfaces again and again in Ireland's royal lore. Many early kings are really personified versions of that sacred marriage and its taboos. Ailill Olam of Munster tries to force himself on Aine, a goddess of love and plenty, and dies beneath her magic. Another Ailill falls hopelessly for Etan, also a goddess, wastes away, and perishes. A third, Ailill Macmata of Connacht, is the pliant husband of Queen Medb, who goads him into the war over the brown bull of Cooley that fuels the great cattle raid epic. Not every High King was a man. Masha of the red hair, daughter of Aed the Red, defeats one rival in battle, marries another to secure her claim, and, after his death, rules alone. The royal seat of Ulster is named for her sons. Her foster son, Eughain the Great, is credited with leading the first Irish raids on Britain. Conaire the Great, placed by tradition in the 1st century before Christ, is born under strange conditions and raised in a tale that reads like a fireside story. His mother, a king's daughter cast out at birth and reared by a cowherd, grows into such beauty that the High King vows to wed her. On the eve of that marriage, she lies with a bird god. The child conceived is Conaire, whom she passes off as the royal heir. Through life, Conaire lives under a strict ban against killing birds. His path to power is marked by a vision quest more familiar from Celtic tales than from chronicles. Druids hold a bull sleep. A seer dreams the sign of the next sovereign, and, guided by that sign, they discover Conaire stripped of all possessions and walking barefoot to Tara after a reprimand from his divine father for having raised a sling against a flock. Shame accepted, taboo restored, he is acclaimed. Conchobar Macnessa, set by tradition in the time of Christ, presides over the court where Cu Chulain's deeds are told. He himself courts Deirdre of the Sorrows, whose beauty fulfills a druid's grim prophecy by bringing ruin and bloodshed. Conchobar dies when a charm ball made from a slain king's brain bursts an old wound in his skull during a late fury. In the 1st century of our era, the Milesian line is said to be interrupted by Carbery Cathead, a usurper whose reign brings famine and sickness. Later, Tuathal the Desired returns from Britain, fights battle after battle to reclaim the High Kingship, carves out Meath as the royal province, restores the Great Assembly at Tara, builds princely residences in each province, and sets 5 great roads radiating from Tara across the island. From Tuathal forward, figures begin to look more human than divine, but myth keeps braiding through their stories. Cathair the Great leaves a celebrated will. Conn of the 100 Battles earns his name in combat, and, after long struggle with Moga, sees Ireland split between Conn's half in the north and Moga's half in the south. Leinster chafes for generations under a cattle tribute ode to Tara. One tale has its warriors hidden in wicker panniers on hundreds of ox teams, bursting out like Greeks from a wooden horse to seize the royal seat. Even these historical rulers move among marvels. Conn takes as mistress Bakuma, the healer, who tricks his son Art into a perilous journey to the land of wonder to seek a woman of fair form. Fergus MacLeod of Ulster wears fairy shoes that let him walk the riverbeds of Ireland, gaining underworld strength until a monstrous water horse horrifies him into a lasting blemish. No longer whole, he abdicates, slays the beast to win back his beauty, loses the shoe's virtue, and drowns. Cormac MacAirt, Conn's grandson, gains a reputation as Ireland's Solomonic king. He rebuilds Tara with a vast banqueting hall, presides over a cosmopolitan court said to host visitors from Gaul, Rome, and beyond, and is credited with the first watermill. His reign ends when the leader of the Daci blinds him in a feud over a woman insulted by Cormac's son. A blemished king cannot rule. He steps down and is later remembered as the putative author of a king's manual and a source for later law, texts that underline an old "break that truth and the world withers." After Cormac, the succession turns murkier, not because the names vanish into myth, but because real politics, alliances, splinters, rival kingships multiply. Muradach Tirek governs long years of strife. Oriel splits off in Ulster. Queenship, too, retains mythic outlines. Medb of Connacht, famed for wealth and will, is said to have wed a string of rulers. Another Medb of Leinster appears as consort to 9 high kings in turn. The meaning is unmistakable. The crown is a marriage to the land's goddess, and without her sanction a man does not reign. Medb's very name is akin to mead. She is intoxication and abundance made flesh. The first fully historical high king is Niall of the 9 Hostages, a raider of Britain whose campaigns and death at sea fall within Roman-dated years. From him descend the Uí Néill, who will dominate the high kingship for centuries. Even saints, like Columba, claim his blood. Niall's origin tales sound like a school for sovereignty. Tested in a burning smithy, he alone seizes anvil and tools, proving kingly sense. Confronted by a withered hag who guards a well, he kisses and lies with her to gain water for his brothers, whereupon she becomes a radiant maiden who pledges the kingship to him. The hideous bride is Ireland herself. The rightful ruler embraces the land in all its forms. Across the narrow sea, a small Irish colony grows into the kingdom of Dal Riata. Niall helps break Pictish pressure and anchor Irish rule along the western coasts and peninsulas. Later assemblies recognize the Scottish branch as an independent realm. At home, Niall's drowning closes one era just before Patrick opens another. By the time Diarmaid MacSurbel is crowned, Ireland is shifting from pagan to Christian, but remains as devout as ever. Great monasteries rise after a plague fells 2 founders. Abbots are often kinsmen of noble houses. One son from many lordly families routinely takes the tonsure. These communities will flourish until the Viking Age, when raiders prize learned men as valuable captives and exploit Irish-on-Irish warfare as much as they wage their own. Meanwhile, the northern story gathers pace. The Irish Dal Riata diverges from its Scottish cousin. The Ulaid's old realm now includes Dal Fiatach, whose king subdues the Isle of Man, where the language grows closest to Scottish Gaelic. Aidan mac Gabrain of Dal Riata strikes hard at Pictish lands, while Britons to the south are squeezed by Anglian power. Strathclyde endures, Cumbria keeps its Brythonic name, and Irish settlers line parts of the Welsh coast. Church and crown do not always move as one. Columba secretly copies a psalter from his master Finian. The High King rules that the copy belongs to the owner of the original, to every cow its calf, and the dispute erupts into battle, after which Columba departs into exile and founds Iona. Farther east, English ascendancy isolates Ireland from British allies. Diorham widens the rift between Welsh and Cornish speech. Northumbria rises. The slaughter at Chester severs the road to the Irish Sea. Man falls to Northumbria. By then, the sea lanes that once carried raiders and saints are closing, and the high kingship, never simple, becomes a title contested amid shifting borders, battling kindreds, and a church that is fast becoming Ireland's other great power. In 635, Aidan established Lindisfarne Priory, and by 640, he had begun preaching in Northumbria. The Christianization of Britain that Augustine set in motion in 597 slowly reopened the channels of trade with Ireland. Progress was uneven. The Church on Iona aligned itself with the Roman calculation of Easter in 716, a practice the English churches had already embraced at the Synod of Whitby in 664. Bede completed his great church history in 731. In 843, Picts and Scots joined forces to withstand Danish pressure, and the first king of the United Realm, Kenneth MacAlpin, died in 860. The Danes seized York in 866, conquered East Anglia in 870, and killed its last king, Edmund. They renewed their Irish campaigns in 916 and overran Munster. Record-keeping for the Irish High Kings grows murky here, as surviving sources focus on local feuds and Norse raids, and alliances shift at high speed. By 937, Danes, Scots, and the Britons of Strathclyde were fighting together against Athelstan at Brunanburh, and not without reward, since the Scots took Cumberland and Westmoreland in 945. One of the first High Kings to push back meaningfully against this Norse tide was Melsechlainn, later known as Malachy, who beat a Danish army at Tara in 979. Brian Boru would later accuse him of dealing with the enemy, but little else is certain about his reign. The name itself gained currency. A churchman called Malachy of Armagh later brought Augustinian canons to Ireland and built a stone oratory at Bangor in 1140 that locals grumbled was too foreign. There had also been a Malachy before him, and a Malachy the Great, whose son Colman died a martyr in 1012. The Northmen, though checked at moments, kept coming. They raided Chester in 980 and struck Dorset, Portland, and South Wales in 982. In 994, Olaf Tryggvason and Swine encircled London. By 1016, Nut ruled all England. In 1020, the Faroes, Shetlands, and Orkneys acknowledged the Norwegian crown. Against this backdrop rose Brian Boru, who defeated the invaders at Clontarf in 1014, and whose name endures in Irish memory as the Towering Warrior King. Brian's forename is now common in English, but it was born Gaelic. His epithet, Boru or Boroimi, comes from the word for a cattle levy. One court tale has Brian and his poet Mac Liag watching vast tribute herds arriving from Ulster and Leinster. The poet praises their abundance. The king rewards the song by giving him the entire herd, and from that day the ruler is styled Brian of the Cattle Tribute. Born in Munster in 926, the son of Kennedig, a noble of Thomond's ruling family, Brian grew up amid Danish incursions and early took the field against them. His brother Mahan became king of Thomond in 951, and later of all Munster, which gave Brian stature and resources. When Mahan was murdered in 976, Brian took revenge and, after 2 years of turmoil, claimed the kingship of Munster for himself. Age did not blunt his ambition. Ireland's political map, carved up by Viking power and settlements, left only one route to the high kingship he coveted: subdue the foreigners, and then bend the other provinces to his will. He began with Leinster, forcing its rulers to swear obedience. He pushed into the Wicklow Hills and into Dublin, burning the Norse farmsteads and driving the settlers west. With Munster and Leinster secure, he turned on Meath. The reigning High King was Malachy, whom Brian suspected of making terms with the Danes. Years of campaigning and several reverses followed, but in 1002, Brian overthrew Malachy and was proclaimed High King at the age of 76. He spent another dozen years on campaign, personally leading armies, until both Connaught and Ulster submitted. His later rule was wise and firm, yet beset by Norse pressure around Dublin and by the endless friction of provincial rivalries that the invaders were only too happy to exploit. On the afternoon of the 23rd of April 1014, Brian's army broke a Danish host at Clontarf. The old king, 88 years of age, had fought at the front with sword in hand. That night, as he slept in his tent, he was murdered. He was laid to rest at Armagh, and a charter bearing his signature survives in Dublin to this day. Ireland has had many champions, but few have stirred the national imagination like Brian Boru. His bravery and persistence elevated the family name O'Brien. It became the title of the earls, and later marquesses of Thomond, whose line claimed descent from Turlogh O'Brien, King of Munster, and recognized High King, himself a descendant of Brian. The Irish war pipes were long known as Brian Boru pipes in his honor. Turlogh's adherence to traditional marriage practices drew the ire of Lanfranc of Canterbury, who in 1074 urged him to purge Ireland of what he called evil customs. Friction between kings and churchmen continued into the next century. At Kells in 1152, the church recognized 4 archbishoprics, and over time dioceses displaced the great monasteries as the backbone of church governance. In 1169, Anglo-Norman forces landed in Ireland, and within a few generations the old order had been transformed. The Pope authorized Henry II to take the island in 1172. English power reached a high point around 1275 before a Gaelic resurgence culminated in the wars of 1315 to 1318, fueled by resentment that English kings had siphoned Irish wealth for foreign projects. It was said that nearly half the money for Edward's fortresses in Wales had been stripped from Ireland. The harsh statutes of Kilkenny of 1366 tried to halt the spread of Irish customs among the settlers by banning the language, the music, and even the national games in English districts. By the 15th century, the Crown's authority had shrunk to the Pale and a handful of great Anglo-Irish lordships. The first Reformation Parliament sat in Dublin in 1536, and 2 decades later, the plantations began, with confiscated lands granted out to colonists. A final tally of high kings can only be conjectural. The roll begins in myth and shades slowly into history, blurring gods and heroes with people of flesh and blood. It starts with Bress the Beautiful, of mixed otherworld and divine stock, and Erimon, remembered as the first Milesian sovereign. It passes through figures credited with the first gold work, a poet king who raised Tara and instituted its feasts, the red-haired Macha who ruled in her own right, and Eughain the Great who carried war to Britain. It names Conair the Great with his strange birth, Conall the shy hero famed for foreign ventures, Eochaid the father of Medb, and Conchobar mac Nessa, whose court heard the feats of Cú Chulainn. It includes usurpers whose reigns brought famine, restorers like Tuathal, who carved out Meath and set the 5 roads, lawgivers and warriors like Conn of the 100 Battles and Cormac MacEirt, judges and builders, kings of Dal Fiatach who first subdued man, rulers praised for mercy, princes honored for feasts, allies of Vikings and men who fought them, 2 men named Malachy who battled Norse power, Brian Boru who fell after victory at Clontarf, Turlogh O'Brien, and Roderick O'Connor, after whose day the fairs at Tailtew ceased and the title of High King faded. However rough their lives or ruthless their methods, these rulers are remembered as the embodiment of an Irish way of rule. Tara today is only a hill in muddy fields, but the high kingship it symbolized remains fused to Ireland's sense of itself. The old poem about the silent harp imagines the music gone from those halls, yet the last lines insist that freedom still lives, showing itself in the breaking of a brave heart rather than the ringing of a lute. As noted earlier, the word Wales stems from the Anglo-Saxon term Whelas, foreigners. The Britons pushed west, or hemmed into their western homelands, first identified themselves by local tribal names. Later, facing a common English adversary, they embraced Cymri, fellow countrymen. That label, from an older Cambrogi, once covered British-speaking peoples all along the Atlantic Rim, and its echo survives in Cumbria. As the old British realms crumbled, Cymri narrowed to the land its people still call Cymru, though English speakers call it Wales. Unlike Ireland, which enjoyed centuries of native rule before the Vikings, Wales lived under one wave after another: Roman administration, pressure from early English settlers, Anglo-Norman conquest, medieval English overlordship, and, many would argue, modern English rule. Even so, a strong sense of Celtic nationhood endured, anchored by a language that survived and, in some ways, thrived, despite constant competition from English on both sides of the Atlantic. Some early intrusions were themselves Celtic. Irish settlers took root on the western seaboard. Dyfed was governed by a dynasty with Irish origins. The name Gwynedd has been read as a Welsh reflex of the Irish Feni, the lineage many medieval Welsh houses claimed in their pedigrees. Those Feni in northwest Wales were displaced by warriors from Gododdin, led by Cunedda, who came south with 8 sons and a grandson when the kingdom of Manau Gododdin collapsed near the end of Roman Britain. The great poem celebrating the Gododdin, along with the poets Aneurin and Taliesin, likely originated in what is now northeastern England or southeastern Scotland, yet have become central to Welsh literary identity. The timing of these movements is debated, Cunedda's very existence even questioned. Magnus Maximus abandoned the legionary base at Saguntium in 383, prompting some to place Cunedda's arrival between 380 and 400, while others put it around 440, making him a contemporary rather than a forerunner of Vortigern. As the early English kingdoms coalesced toward an England, Welsh polities were also forming. Sometimes a single ruler, in the manner of an Irish high king, asserted authority over lesser dynasts. Sometimes alliances were struck with English neighbors, sometimes wars were fought against them. In the end, as in Ireland, Norse incursions and then English power asserted supremacy, but for centuries Welsh dynasties rose and fell in their own right. Before the historical role begins, Welsh tradition sets a mythic ruler at the threshold: Bran, son of the sea god Lir. His name means crow or raven, and he is often called Bendigeidfran, the Blessed. He married his sister Branwen to the Irish king Matholwch, but their half-brother Efnisien, left unconsulted, mutilated the Irish horses in revenge. Bran placated Matholwch with a magical cauldron that restored the dead to life, though speechless. When Branwen was later humiliated in Ireland, Bran led a rescue that ended in slaughter. Only 7 companions returned. Bran himself died of a festering wound and ordered his head severed. The head remained alive, entertaining the survivors until they finally buried it beneath White Hill in London, where the tower now stands, a token of protection mirrored in the tower's ravens. The story suits the real backdrop of 2nd to 4th century sea raids crossing between Ireland and Wales, though the notion of a single ruler of all Britain belongs to legend. Cunedda, the the culture hero credited with founding the northern house of Gwynedd, stands at the head of one of 3 famed royal tribal lines in later Welsh memory. The dynasties of Gwynedd and Powys in the north, and the looser southern bloc, later called Deheubarth. The southern name derives from Latin for the right-hand part. By contrast, a phrase meaning men of the left hand came to denote the north and still carries that directional sense in modern Welsh. The landscape was a mosaic of small tribal kingdoms, much like those in Strathclyde, Manaw Gododin, and Old Gaul, a classic Celtic patchwork of tribe, sept, and clan. Some survived in a kind of stubborn independence for astonishing lengths of time. Real movement toward wider unity does not appear until Merfyn Ffraich and his son Rhodri Mawr in the 9th century, then Hywel Dda in the 10th. Even then, a few pocket realms could boast lineages stretching back 5 centuries. Powys grew on its own foundations, rooted in the powerful Cornovi, whose lands straddled the upper Severn and Dee before the legions came. The kingdom's name likely comes from the Latin word for a rural district, the ancestor of pagan. By the early medieval period, Builth and Gwerthrynion on the upper Wye had fallen within Powys. Gwerthrynion memorializes Gwertheurin, the Welsh form of Vortigern, whose descendants were later claimed, despite his tarnished reputation after the Saxon invitation, as ancestors by local rulers. Between Gwynedd and Powys sat smaller territories such as Meirionnydd, Penllyn, and Adernion. In the southeast, where Rome had bitten deepest, petty realms persisted around strongholds and monasteries. Gwent took its name from Caerwent and embraced old Roman cities like Cardiff and Caerleon, alongside ecclesiastical centers like Llangcarfan, Llandaff, and Lonaltud. Dyfed in the southwest, marked by Ogham stones and renewed Irish settlement after Rome withdrew, retained distinct speech and custom for centuries. Brecknock to the south managed its own affairs from the 5th to the 10th century. Other southern polities, among them Ystrad Tiwi, Gower, and Brycheiniog, followed their own courses. Morgan Twumdiwgi, later Glamorgan, maintained a separate identity into the Norman era, marrying Roman roots to a durable church network. The crucial centuries in which Wales, northern Britain, and eastern Britain were all changing shape were roughly 400 to 600. Evidence is sparse and loaded with bias. Gildas wrote a scolding, learned Latin sermon on the fall of Britain around 540. The life of St. Samson offers a limited window from the same era. The poems of Taliesin and Aneurin were not written down until the 13th century, though likely composed around 600, and their authors probably hailed from the Old North rather than Wales proper. Bede's masterful history appeared in 731, but his hostility to the Welsh is plain. The Welsh genealogies were not compiled until much later, and the Annals of Wales likely took shape around 960 at the request of Owain ap Hywel Dda. Eager medieval compilers sometimes padded pedigrees to bolster claims, minting founders from place names. That habit, as with Geoffrey of Monmouth's inventions, muddies the record. After Vortigern's time, the first figure to stride from the haze is Melgwyn ap Cadwallon, celebrated as Melgwyn the Great of Gwynedd. He was no national king, but a powerful northern ruler whose seat at Deganwy has yielded finds from southern Gaul, Athens, and the Black Sea, evidence of elite connections. Later ages cast him, like Arthur, as an ideal warrior king. He held court at Aberfrau on Anglesey and is said to have died in the plague of 549, which would make him Arthur's rough contemporary if both are historical. Early law materials trace some concepts back to his influence. He patronized poets and minstrels, and later princes prized descent from Rhodri Mawr, and through him, from Maelgwn. When Llywelyn summoned southern rulers to pay homage in 1216, he chose Aberdyfi, recalling the place where Maelgwn's supremacy was once acclaimed. Between 550 and 650, the Saxons seized most of southern Britain. They took Salisbury in 552 and Aylesbury in 571. The battle at Diorham in 577, where 3 British kings fell, and Bath, Cirencester, and Gloucester were captured, severed the Britons north of the Severn from those to the southwest. From then on, Cornish and Welsh followed separate linguistic paths. Even so, Dumnonia, Cornwall, Devon, and parts of Somerset endured for some time. There was a Celtic king in Devon as late as 710, and Cornwall still had a native king in 878. Formally absorbed by Wessex in 950, Cornwall remained a Celtic-speaking land for centuries more, and, in language and spirit, a Celtic nation well into the early modern era. Maelgwn's line was Christian. The church at Llangadwaladr, near Aberfrav, preserves a Latin epitaph to King Cadfan praising him as the wisest and most renowned of rulers. His son Cadwallon slew Edwin of Northumbria in 633, the first English king to invade Wales, and then killed Edwin's successors Osric and Eanfrith. Pursuing the Northumbrians, Cadwallon fell in battle the next year. Mercia, the last great English kingdom to rise, dominated between roughly 640 and 800. Its western push fixed the eastern boundary of Powys and, in time, of Wales. The Powys capital at Penquern was sacked in 642, a loss lamented 2 centuries later in elegy. Welsh princes strove to reclaim old lands until King Offa of Mercia imposed a new frontier with the earthwork long called Offa's Dyke, built sometime between about 780 and 796. Longer than Hadrian's Wall, but far less dramatic, it functioned as a border rather than a fortress, an earthen bank and ditch, not permanently garrisoned, with deliberate gaps where forest or the winding Severn sufficed. Substantial stretches still run unbroken from near Trudden in the north to the River Arrow in Radnorshire, with further traces toward Monmouth and the Severn's mouth on the Beachley Peninsula. Its course suggests deals with local rulers. Near Rhiwabon, the line seems drawn to leave Cadell ap Brochwel in possession of a stronghold at Pennygarden. In Gwent, the dike veers east of the natural Wye boundary to keep traditional estuary harbors in Welsh hands. Offa died at Rhuddlan in 796. Though unfinished, his dike fixed the outline of Wales' eastern edge. By then, the language had differentiated into distinctly Welsh, no longer the broader Brythonic speech. As in English, old case endings fell away, and Latinized name forms such as Maglocanus and Caraticus slimmed to Maelgwn and Cadog. Names themselves repeated generation after generation, compounding later confusion. As any Welsh telephone book still shows, a handful of surnames dominate. The royal genealogies likewise teem with repeated Maelgwans, Llewellyns, Cadels, and Gruffuds, distinguished only by ap, son of this or that father, and by the house or region that claimed them. Roughly half a century after Offa's death, a ruler emerged who can fairly be called the first recognizably Welsh king, rather than a broadly Brythonic one. This was Rhodri, later celebrated as Rhodri Mawr, the Great, a direct descendant of Maelgwn Fawr. Through a dense web of marriages and inheritances, he drew the principal northern and central houses into one line. Gwynedd came to him on the death of his father Myrfin in 844. Powys fell to him in 855 after his uncle Tingen died, and Seisilug passed to him in 871 on the death of his brother-in-law Gugun. His pedigree linked him to Cole Hen, remembered in lore as Old King Cole. Rhodri's renown, however, rested not only on how much land he controlled, from Anglesey in the north to Gower in the south, but on his ferocity against Viking raiders. In 856, he crushed a Danish force, killed their leader Horn, and retook Anglesey, long revered as a heartland of Druidic tradition. The victory heartened Irish and Frankish audiences and rekindled morale among Romanized Britons who were becoming the Welsh. He also fought the English on the Powys frontier as Mercia waned and Wessex surged westward. Rhodri and his son Griad were both killed battling the West Saxons in 877. Rhodri's son Cadell succeeded him, but it was Rhodri's grandson who eclipsed them all, Hywel, son of Cadell, known to posterity as Hywel Da, the Good. Hywel first ruled Seisilug by marrying Ellen, sister of Liwarch of Dyfed, and on Liwarch's death in 904, Hywel added Dyfed to his titles, likely taking Brycheiniog as well. This southern bloc later became known as Deheubarth. At the same time, Gwynedd and Powys were in the hands of Idwal ab Anaraud, another grandson of Rhodri. In 942, Hywel united Gwynedd, Powys, and Deheubarth under his authority, making him, for the first time, something close to a king of all Wales, with the southeast, Gwent and Morgan Nogoinai, the main exception. The rulers of Glamorgan were themselves descendants of Rhodri through his daughter Nest. Hywel's epithet derives chiefly from his role in shaping Welsh law, rather than from personal saintliness. He journeyed to Rome in 928, later tradition saying he sought papal blessing on his code. He also cultivated ties at the English court. The laws associated with his name, first proclaimed, according to tradition, at Whitland on the border of Dyfed and Cecilwg, survive primarily in Welsh, though the earliest extant manuscript is a Latin copy from around 1230, derived from a text compiled about 1175. Over time, glosses, amendments, and case notes were folded into the corpus, keeping Hywel's settlement influential long after his death. One striking feature sets these laws apart from canon practice. They recognized 9 forms of marital union and laid out practical rules for division of property when unions dissolved, preserving a distinctly Celtic legal spirit over a Roman or ecclesiastical one. Hywel died in 950, and the old fault line between north and south reopened. His son Owain held Deheubarth, while Gwynedd and Powys returned to Idwal ab Anaraud's line. Owain's sons Aenion and Meredud both reigned in turn. From 986 to 999, Meredud ab Owain rebuilt something like Hywel's sway, but his era was scourged by Viking pressure. With strongholds in Dublin and Man, Norse fleets ravaged the coasts. Place names like Anglesey, Bardsey, Caldey, Fishguard, and Swansea still carry the imprint. In 987, raiders seized more than 2,000 captives on Anglesey. 2 years later, Meredud levied a penny per head to buy them off, but the attacks continued, and in 999, they struck St. David's and murdered Bishop Morgannau. At the millennium, Wales was again a patchwork until Gruffudd ap Llywelyn forged a rare unity between 1039 and 1063. He was the only ruler to command all Wales, including Morgan W.G. His lineage was tangled, as most were, yet through his mother Angharad, daughter of Meredud ab Owain, he could trace back to Hywel Da and Rhodri Mor. Gruffudd seized Gwynedd and Powys in 1039, by killing Iago ab Idwal, then fought a prolonged contest in the south with Gruffudd ap Rhydderch before prevailing in 1055. By 1056 or 1057, he had taken Glamorgan from Cadogan ap Muirig. For roughly 7 years after 1057, Wales was a single realm under one man. Gruffudd fought beyond his borders too, beating Leofric of Mercia in 1039 and, allied with Leofric's son Elfgar, burning Hereford and clawing back Marcher lands long held by the English. Harold, Earl of Wessex, soon to be king, responded with repeated campaigns. In the summer of 1063, Gruffudd was killed in Snowdonia, some say by his own followers. With his death, Wales reverted to fractious norms. Gwynedd and Powys split, Deheubarth stood apart, and smaller lordships shifted hands. Harold left the divided Welsh largely alone. Gwynedd first went to a boy of Irish-Norse descent named Gruffudd, then to Bledden and Rhiwallon, half-brothers of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. Deheubarth fell to Meredudd ab Owain. Caradog, son of Gruffudd ap Rhydderch, seized Gwent and Gwynel Dubug, while Cadogan ap Muirig recovered the rest of Glamorgan. 3 years later, in 1066, William of Normandy won Hastings, slew Harold, and brought Norman rule to Britain. The Normans viewed Scotland more as a partner than a possession, but they recognized the distinctiveness of both northern and Welsh polities. They crushed the Saxon English to a servile class, yet initially managed courteous relations with Welsh elites, cementing marriages and admiring the country's poetry and long-standing secular law rooted in Hywel's settlement. That truce could not outlast Norman expectations of feudal order. Between 1066 and 1081, William largely let Welsh princes exhaust one another. By 1081, 2 leaders stood out: Gruffudd ap Cynan in Gwynedd and Rhys ap Tudor in Deheubarth. William planted a line of border barons, Fitzosborne at Hereford, Roger de Montgomery at Shrewsbury, and Hugh of Avranches at Chester. And by 1086, Norman castles anchored Caerleon, Chepstow, and Monmouth. Hugh captured Gruffudd ap Cynan and kept him 12 years. The Great Survey notes Rhys ap Tudor paid the king £40 a year. When William Rufus succeeded in 1087, Marcher lords pushed deeper into Wales. Rhys ap Tudor died fighting Bernard of Neufmarche in 1093, and Brycheiniog, Pembrokeshire, and Glamorgan fell. In the south, the Normans reached across Dyfed and razed Pembroke Castle, one of their strongest fortresses. For centuries thereafter, a shifting belt of fortified lordships buffered England and the Welsh heartland. This frontier, the Welsh March, produced powerful earls with quasi-sovereign rights that, ironically, preserved a line between England and Inner Wales. The Mortimers exemplified the type: vast Shropshire and Herefordshire estates, foundations like Wigmore Priory, and high offices in Ireland. The March earldom would eventually merge into the English crown when an heir died without issue. Within the mountains and valleys beyond the Marches, native dynasties endured into the early 15th century, their pedigrees dense and names repeating in cycles: Powys with its Maydogs and Gruffudds, Deheubarth with its Melgwans and Rhysses, plus Owains and Meredudds, Gwynedd with further Llywelyns, Meredudds, Gruffudds, Owains, Cynans, and Arodri. From 2 of these lines came the last great warrior of the old Welsh mold, Owain Glyndwr. His mother, Ellen, descended from the Lord Rhys of Deheubarth. His father, Gruffudd Fichan II, was of Powys. Born around 1359 at Glyndifordwy in Merioneth, he studied law at Westminster, served briefly as squire to the Earl of Arundel, and later joined the household of Henry of Bolingbroke. A long-standing feud with the Greys of Ruthin sparked his revolt. In 1400, Reginald Grey failed to summon Owain to campaign against Scotland, then accused him of treason for not appearing. Welsh loyalties leaned toward the deposed Richard II, and Owain's private quarrel fused with national grievance. Henry IV's first foray into Wales faltered in late 1400. Another failed in 1401. Over the winter, Owain secured understanding with Irish, Scots, and French allies and cultivated powerful English sympathizers, including Henry Percy and Sir Edmund Mortimer. In 1402, he sacked Ruthin and captured Grey. Later that year, he defeated Herefordshire levies under Mortimer. Mortimer soon married Owain's daughter. A third English campaign failed that autumn. Owain proclaimed himself Prince of Wales, set up a government, and summoned a parliament at Machynlleth. French troops landed in support, and by 1404, Harlech and Aberystwyth were in Welsh hands. For a moment, the dream of a restored Welsh kingdom, glimpsed only once before under Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, seemed close. In 1405, the tide turned. Aberystwyth fell in 1408 after a long siege. Harlech followed in 1409, and Owain's family was taken. His own end is uncertain. One chronicle places his death in 1415. Tradition says he slipped into obscurity, sheltered by kin, and died quietly at Monington. Modern Welsh political life debates devolution more than outright independence, yet in every such conversation, Owain Glyndwr looms large. Others, Maelgwn, Rhodri Mor, Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, achieved sweeping power, but Owain has become the nation's emblem, the heroic, defiant figure through whom folklore and memory distill the enduring Celtic spirit of Wales. In late Roman times, the northwest corner of Gaul, known to the empire as long-haired Gaul, was increasingly called Armorica. As Irish raiders struck Britain's shores in the 5th century, some Britons themselves took to the sea. Crossing from the old kingdom of Dumnonia, they planted small British colonies along Armorica's coast. Their speech was still Brythonic, rather than the later Cornish or Welsh, and would have sounded close, though not identical, to the Latin-tinged Gaelic spoken locally. By around 450, a patchwork of British or Breton petty rulers held much of the land north of the Loire, ruling communities that mingled newcomers with people of native Gallic stock. The sources for this formative era are thin. The migration accelerated in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries as refugees fled the advance of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in Britain. Successive waves swelled those beachheads into a distinct Celtic country: Briege, Bretagne, Brittany. Like Wales and Scotland, it developed a long tradition of independence or semi-independence, and, just as importantly, kept a strong language and culture that still endure. The largest, and likely earliest, Breton realm was Domnonia in the north, its name echoing Dumnonia across the Channel. In 530, it absorbed Leon in the far northwest, which had previously stood apart. The life of Saint Samson of Dol calls Domnonia Pretinaland, a form of the same root that gives us Pryden in Welsh and Bretagne in French. Tradition names Rhywal of the House of Gwent as its founder, though the name may be more title than person, with the first element simply meaning king. South of Domnonia lay Cornwall, a name that seems to mirror Cornwall, though the link cannot be firmly shown before the 9th century. Its early rulers remain shadowy, surfacing only in scattered references within saints' lives. A third polity, Bro Warroch, occupied the lands once held by the Veneti, famed seafarers who had long dealings with Britain. Warroch, the 6th century leader who defied Frankish pressure, gave the district his name. Older ties across the water were strong enough that even the figure of Vortigern appears in Breton lore as Saint Gurthium. Early Breton narrative is overwhelmingly hagiographic because ecclesiastical leaders guided the settlement. Those who escaped heathen invaders in Britain were Christian colonists whose chiefs were abbots, teachers, and spiritual wayfarers. They often took unused heath or deep forest rather than displace established towns, a pattern that suits communities held together by faith more than by conquest. St. Mene, of royal Welsh blood, founded a monastery in the great forest of Brocéliande and remained close to King Judicael of Domnonia, though his life is told as quiet labor rather than royal intrigue. The Cornish patron Meriadoc is said to have served as a Breton bishop, and St. Malo's story tells how he cleared land, found a golden ram, and secured tenure from a Frankish king. Such tales suggest a leadership style that feels closer to the old druidic ideal of learned authority than to dynastic ambition. The first ruler to emerge clearly from Breton history is Cunimor of Poher in the 6th century, his name built from Celtic elements that mean hound and great. An inscription in Cornwall shows the name was widespread. From his stronghold at Carhaix, he expanded to dominate Domnonia, Poher, and Leon around 540 to 554. Breton tradition casts him as a usurper whose own people finally turned on him. Frankish power complicated everything. As Merovingian kings consolidated Gaul, they refused to acknowledge Breton sovereignty and pressed Breton rulers to accept the lesser title of count instead of king. The Bretons resisted. Warrach raided Nantes in 587, and in 590, a Frankish army was beaten by his son Canau. This stubborn independence lasted for centuries. Even Charlemagne sent 3 campaigns to bring the peninsula to heel, and still the chiefs endured. By the mid-9th century, however, Frankish dominance was too great. Salomon, son of Erispo, did homage to Charles the Bald and was executed in 874 when he tried to throw off that pledge, ending the last formal bid for a sovereign Breton crown. Yet Brittany's independence did not end in spirit. The language and identity persisted, and modern memory still stings at schoolroom humiliations, where children were shamed for speaking Breton, and at harsh punishments of young men who resisted conscription into the French army. Through all of it, Brittany has remained unmistakably itself. While classical writers, archaeology, and medieval chroniclers tell us a great deal about the Celts, there is another trove that illuminates how kingship worked in their world, the literature written in their own tongues. These stories, steeped in myth and folklore, rarely yield reliable facts about particular rulers. What they do reveal, often vividly, is what a king or queen was expected to be within Celtic society. 2 intertwined traditions dominate: the Goidelic, essentially Irish, and the Brythonic, largely Welsh. A few tales likely arose elsewhere. Tristan and Isolde, for instance, almost certainly has Cornish roots, but the overwhelming bulk is Irish or Welsh. Often the same narrative threads appear on both sides of the Irish Sea, with clear correspondences and shared motifs. Pinning down which version came first is a fool's errand. These tales lived for centuries by word of mouth, before clerics copied them, and the date of the manuscript rarely matches the age of the story. Many pieces are timeless myth. Others drop the names of supposed historical figures in ways so tangled that they shed little light. Because monks did the writing, pagan warrior worlds frequently collide on the page with Christian morals and imagery, dragons and saints, otherworld paradises and churchly hells, goddesses and fighting queens alongside invocations of Christ. Scholars group the Irish material into 4 cycles. The mythological cycle centers on the early divine races, Fomorians, Tuatha De Danann, and the fairy folk, probably the oldest stratum. The Ulster cycle, set around the time of Christ, recounts the deeds of the Ulaid. Some elements may be historical, though they are hard to isolate. The King's cycle gathers tales of early rulers such as Brace, Conn, and Eochaid, figures who straddle legend and history. The Fenian or Finn cycle, popular from the 12th century onward and perhaps later in origin, celebrates Fionn mac Cumhail. These categories help, but they blur at the edges. Characters roam across cycles, and storytellers allude freely to incidents their audiences were expected to know. Irish tales were probably first written down in the 8th century. An early collection, now lost, contained versions of the wooing of Étaín, the destruction of Daderga's hostel, and the birth of Cuchulainn. Viking raids destroyed many of the oldest books. 12th century manuscripts preserve fragments and fuller retellings, among them the Book of the Dun Cow and the Book of Leinster, while later compilations like the Yellow Book of Lecan add further iterations. On the Welsh side, most of what survives is in the White Book of Ridderch and the Red Book of Hergest. Though copied in the 14th and 15th centuries, the stories themselves are far older. The oldest by subject may be Culhwch and Olwen. Lady Charlotte Guest's 19th century edition popularized the collective label Mabinogion, a name that stuck even if its grammar was off. A recurring hallmark is the unusual birth. Celtic lore assumes the rightful ruler already exists and must be found. The bull dream that reveals a king. The sword drawn from stone. The sense of destiny is strong, sometimes shading into the idea of an enduring soul that reappears. In the Tyne, a druid declares that the present moment is suited to conceiving a king whose fame will never fade, and a union immediately follows. The child, Conchobar, later High King, remains in the womb for 39 months, a number with sacred overtones. Another ruler is carried for 9 years and 9 months after his mother is visited by a sea spirit. The king's arrival feels foreordained. That belief had social consequences. Among the Ulstermen, Conchobar is so revered that newlyweds let the king lie first with the bride, so his seed might enter their lineage. The tales treat this without embarrassment. Power and fertility are bound together. Cuchulainn's origins show the same insistence on destiny. A foundling and 2 foals appear overnight. When the child dies, his spirit leaps into the cup of Conchobar's sister, who becomes pregnant. Later, after an arranged marriage, she bears a son named Setanta, the hero who will become Cuchulainn. The message is clear. The hero refuses to be denied and will enter the world by any path he can. Heroes often look different from ordinary men. Distinctions skirt the line between nobility and blemish. Cuchulainn gleams with colored patches in his cheeks and eyes bright as if lit from within, hair in 3 hues stiffened with lime. Legendary kings, too, are fostered by wolves or miraculously conceived by gods in animal form. Celtic saints inherit this texture. Infants nursed by wild creatures, mothers visited by spirits or angels, births foretold by shining signs or prophetic holy people. Above all, a ruler must fight. Titles and wise counsel mean little unless the leader can take the field. Training scenes revel in ferocious discipline. Feet scorched on a heated flagstone, balancing on a spear point, flipping across a narrow bridge. Cuchulainn's famed warp spasm transforms him into something monstrous and terrible, a living personification of battle rage. Later chivalric literature borrows these ordeal motifs, translating them into tests of devotion or endurance. His schooling under Scathach, a woman warrior and seer, reads like a catalogue of lethal arts. The apple-juggling feat, the salmon leap, sword-edge balances, rope and javelin tricks, the hooked spear that rips a foe from within, the hero's scream that freezes enemies. The exuberant savagery of the tale of Macduthau's pig captures the warrior code. A grotesque feast boasts that spiral into slaughter, and a host who unleashes a warhound just to see which side it favors. Women meet the same standard of ferocity. Saint Cain of Cornwall is remembered in gentle folklore, but behind the saint stands a princess of Brecknock from a dynasty hardened by war, an echo of the warrior queen embedded in the legend. In Irish story, Macha is forced to race the king's chariot while in labor, then curses the men who refused her mercy so they will know her pangs in their hour of greatest peril. Deirdre of the Sorrows, whose wail before birth foretells calamity, ends her life by dashing her head against a stone rather than submit to men she loathes. Scathach's rival, Aoife, hardest of all women, nearly defeats Cú Chulainn until he tricks her. The contest is as brutal and tactical as any between men. Queens command and calculate with cold clarity. Medb of Connaught assesses elite troops not for loyalty, but for the risk they will steal her glory, and considers annihilating them to remove the threat. The stories make no apology for such iron logic. Sovereignty demands ruthlessness. Behind these human queens loom the battle goddesses, the Morrigan, Badb, Macha, Nemain, who preside over carnage. They wash a hero's gear at the ford as an omen of death, shift shape at will, shriek soldiers into panic, and perch as crows upon the fallen. The banshee is their folk echo, the wailing woman whose keen warns of a passing, sometimes imagined as leading a ghostly coach drawn by headless horses. Fertility and destruction mingle in these figures as naturally as in the land itself. Taken together, the Irish and Welsh tales sketch a coherent ideal. The rightful sovereign arrives by fate's decree, often through marvels. He or she bears a striking presence, wields unmatched skill, and proves worth in combat and endurance. Honor binds the tongue and the deed, yet calculation and ferocity are never far away. The stories may not identify many real kings or queens, but they leave no doubt about what a Celtic people wanted from those who claimed the right to rule. One theme that never stops circling back in Celtic lore is succession, the handing of the land from one sovereign to the next. Because kingship itself is imagined as a sacred union with the land, often personified as a goddess, the clash between an incumbent and a challenger becomes more than politics. It echoes an older mythic rhythm, the bright youth of spring supplanting the heavy lord of autumn. Bel is the young sun, the lover and rising year. Bran is the thunderous father, the waning season. The son grows into the father yields to the son, and the wheel turns forever. Beneath the wonder tales of shape-changing and wizardly duels lies a stark psychology. The son contending with the father for the mother, who stands for sovereignty itself. The most famous chase of transformations sets a twist on that contest. In the Welsh tale of Taliesin, the goddess witch Ceridwen brews inspiration in her cauldron. A boy named Gwion, tending the pot, burns his thumb, sucks it, and in an instant knows all things. He has stolen divine power, in effect usurping the queen's prerogative, which is to hold life, death, and wisdom. Ceridwen hunts him through a chain of forms, hare and greyhound, fish and otter, bird and hawk, until he hides as a grain in a heap of wheat. She becomes a black hen and swallows him back into herself. The imagery is blunt. The cauldron is the womb. The swallowed seed becomes pregnancy. The goddess conceives and births him anew. The message is unmissable. The goddess endures and prevails. Kings come and go. The land remains. Irish story speaks just as plainly. The Dagda, a gluttonous, club-bearing giant of a god, mates with river and war goddesses alike, his couplings depicted as a ritual joining of ruler and territory. These liaisons can be comic in their hunger for food and sex. But when he lies with the Morrigan, the tone darkens, because sovereignty is as terrible as it is fertile. Earlier Irish tales are blunt about desire and rivalry. Later, Brythonic romances, carried into the matter of Britain, veil the same engine of succession in courtesy, enchantment, and high sentiment, but the structure underneath is unchanged. Sometimes the rivals are brothers rather than father and son. In Welsh tradition, Arawn, the otherworld king, and Amathon, the plough god, both children of the great mother Dawn, fall out over a stolen hound, deer, and bird. Their quarrel swells into the battle of the trees, a riddle song of marching woods, secret names, and seized shrines, as if a new cult overwrote an older one by learning and speaking the true name of its god. Elsewhere the rivalry slips skins. In the prologue to the Tyne, two fairy swineherds, expelled from their courts, duel through a chain of avatars, hawks slashing the air, sea beasts threshing the deep, stags ruining one another's herds, warriors, phantoms, dragons that snow disaster, until they drop as maggots into drinking streams and are swallowed by cows. Each is reborn as a mighty bull, one white, one brown, whose eventual clash ignites the great cattle raid. The tale insists that power reincarnates, changes shape, and keeps on fighting. The father-son wound is barest in Cu Chulain's tragedy. He meets and kills his own son, Conla, born of the warrior Aife. The outcome is foreknown, yet the champion pushes toward it with a terrible momentum, speech fractured by the fever of feats and duty to Ulster. The story grants him no easy grief. Victory and loss are fused, as if the hero can only affirm who he is by destroying what he loves. Even at the Tyen's apex, the narrative pivots back to sovereignty's body. When Cu Chulainn finally stands over Medb, her menses begin. The text pauses to note the blood and the necessity of tending to it. The duel dissolves. He stays his hand. The queen lives. The image is shockingly frank and perfectly apt. The land continues, fertile and inviolate, even as kings maim and die around her. A more tender version of the cycle arrives in the dream of Ongus. The ever-young god longs for a woman seen in vision, care of the yew-berry, a name shadowed with death. To claim her, he must face her otherworld father and cross the hinge night of Samhain, when passage between worlds is easiest. They transform into swans, emblems of lifelong bond and funerary journey, and fly together to Ungus's home on the Boyne. Romance here is not escape from the old pattern. It is the pattern retold with grace. Wales offers a labyrinthine study in Math, son of Mathonwy. Math, a king whose life depends on resting his feet in a maiden's lap outside of wartime, and his nephew Gwydion, a master enchanter, stir a southern war and draw Gwydion's sister Orianrhod into a test that exposes concealed motherhood. From her come two sons, Dylan, claimed by the sea, and Lo Law Gifes, prodigy and heir. Orianrhod curses Lo with taboos so strict he cannot wed a mortal woman. Math and Gwydion craft him a bride of blossoms, Blodeuwed, who betrays him with Gron. Lugh can be killed only in a position that is neither inside nor out, neither on foot nor mounted, neither on land nor water. Blodeuwedd coaxes him to demonstrate. Gron strikes, and Lugh escapes as an eagle to rot in a tree until Gwydion sings him back to human shape. Blodeuwedd is turned into an owl. Gron endures the return blow through a shield-pierced stone and dies. Beneath the marvels we recognize the old arrangement. Nephew as heir, the perilous bride, the ritual of exchange and retribution that restores the right line. Even Math's foot-right fits the larger pattern. The virgin on whose lap he rests embodies unspent generative power, the pure well of the land's life. In war, the right is suspended, as if the king then meets time and mortality directly and needs no symbolic marriage to assure his bond with the country. Across all these stories, the logic is consistent. Sovereignty is female and enduring. Kingship is a temporary office proved in courage, trickery, desire, and ordeal. Successors arrive in visions, in strange births, by oaths and taboos and the breaking of them. The shapes change, the cycle does not. Conchobar. Mac Nessa was praised as a judge who never spoke too soon. He waited until a decision had matured, fearing that a careless ruling might blight the fields. In this world, speech carried force. A true word nourished the land. A false one invited rot, famine, sickness, and death. In Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, the weight of a promise shows how perilous language can be. A stranger walks into Pwyll's wedding feast with Rhiannon and asks for a boon. Pwyll, playing the generous lord, vows to grant whatever is asked. The man demands Rhiannon's bed, the very suitor she has fled. Only Rhiannon's cunning and magic untangle the disaster. She tells Pwyll bluntly that silence would have been wiser than such foolish speech. Irish story has a name for a different kind of utterance, imbus forasnai, the sudden light of foresight. It is not earned through study, it descends. The prophet Fedalm beholds the fate of Medb's host in the Tyne, and will not be bullied from her vision, repeating that she sees only red. Scathach, Cuchulain's war mistress, looks ahead with the same clear sight and names his future of triumph and desire. Kings and queens, not only druids and seers, stand near enough to timelessness that they sometimes view what lies beyond the present. Later legend gives this faculty to Merlin alone. Earlier tales let it move through rulers as part of A recurring image captures the mortal sovereign chasing eternity. Horsemen on the road, one forever a spear's length ahead. In the destruction of Da Durga's hostel, Conair Mór spurs after 3 riders dressed entirely in red, from tunic to teeth, on red horses under red shields. He lashes his mount, yet never draws closer, nor do they fall behind. Their color marks them as otherworldly. The same shape appears in Wales when Pwyll pursues Rhiannon across the plain of Arbroath. None of his men can catch her. He tries the swiftest horse in the realm, and fails, until he calls out to her to wait for the sake of the one she loves. She stops at once and chides him that he might have spared his horse had he spoken sooner. Words, rightly placed, outstrip any gallop. Rhiannon's name echoes maidenhood in Welsh and has been linked to a title meaning mighty queen. In the tale, she must bear guests upon her back as penance, a sign of the horse goddess revered across the Celtic world, often seen as a white mare. Medieval writers tell of a stark Irish kingship rite in which the new ruler unites with a white mare. The animal is slain and boiled. The king bathes in the broth and drinks from the vat, and the company feasts. However embellished the account, the meaning is clear enough. Sovereignty is embodied in the horse, and the king becomes one with it. A ruler draws power by stepping across the border of ordinary time. Pwyll earns the title Chief of Andubuin by trading places for a year and a day with Aran, the otherworld king. He shares a court, even a bed, yet keeps his honor. When they exchange lives again, Aran blesses him, and Pwyll's land brims with fruitfulness. The lesson is simple and deep. A king who travels into the beyond brings back fertility. The Mabinogion often wraps such passages in subtle, dreamlike scenes. In Manawydan's Son of Lir, Pryderi follows a white boar and his hounds into an empty fortress. No people, no animals, only a marble fountain and a golden bowl suspended by 4 chains rising into the air with no visible end. He reaches for the bowl, his hands fixed to it, his feet to the slab, and his voice fails. The image prefigures every later holy vessel, a womb of wonder that both offers and binds. When fortune walks with him, the king bends the wild to his will. Cuchulainn fixes a stag with a glance and calmly yokes it between the shafts of his chariot. Women who love the great champions mirror their marks. Necks bent after Conall, stammers after Cuscraid, one eye dimmed for the sake of Cuchulainn's fearsome contortion. But when fate turns against a champion, the world itself rises. As Cuchulainn wrestles Loch Macmofemis in a stream, an eel coils his leg, a wolf lunges, cattle thunder down upon him, and the wolf shifts into a red, hornless heifer at their head. These are the land's goddesses closing in. They are no gentle fates. A later Irish tale turns the punishment into a Christian key. Subnagailt, an angry king, throws a saint's psalter into a lake to protest an unauthorized church. Cursed, he goes mad, flitting through treetops for 7 years as if he were a bird, tormented by visions of severed heads and headless bodies. Only baptism grants him rest at the end. The old pattern remains, but the framework has changed. Beyond prophecy and battle, the ruler must judge. Druids often settled quarrels, yet kings were expected to bind communities with fair amends. After a Phoenician mutilates Matulf's horses, Bran offers compensation measured to honor. Sound horses for the ruined ones, a rod of silver equal to the king's height and breadth of finger, a broad gold plate, open admission of the offense, and an invitation to negotiate terms face to face. Peace fails and war follows, but the tale preserves the ideal. A sovereign is an arbiter whose remedies should heal without shame. Inauguration, when it comes, recognizes who is already fit. The pool is narrow. Signs are sought, sometimes by public acclaim, sometimes by ritual dream. The chosen must be whole in body, striking in presence, seasoned in war, and above all wedded to the land. Irish law spoke of sovereignty as a royal marriage. From that union, fields swell with grain, rivers run with fish, herds multiply. If the blessings falter, even a beloved ruler may be pressed aside. In Pwyll's case, the people grow anxious after years without an heir and insist that he take measures. They love him, but will not accept barrenness in their lord. Early Celtic rulers seem not to have worn crowns as emblems. Later ages adopt diadems and circlets from Rome, but older marks of office are more elusive, often confused with the white staffs of druidic judges. Far more telling than any metal is the calendar itself. Midsummer stands as the fitting day for accession. The August feast named for Lugh is a commemoration, a mourning for the oak king who yields, a greeting for the bright sun god who rises. It is no accident that the day of John the Baptist falls at the height of light, the herald announcing the one to come. In that season, the new king steps forward, the old power wanes, and the land, listening to true words, breathes again. The journey through Celtic history has taken us from ancient kingdoms to the beliefs that shaped their social, religious, and political life, and to the royal ideals preserved in myth. To close, we can trace how these ideas traveled across centuries and continents, and how they still leave their mark on the wider world and on Celtic nations themselves. The vitality people call the Celtic spirit did not vanish with early polities. It lives on in language and song, in law and memory, and in the identities of Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. Even England carries its imprint. Waves of migration carried that heritage to North America and the Antipodes, where Cornish pasties, Gaelic services, fiddle tunes, and family names stitched distant communities back to Celtic homelands. A curious window into that spread appears in a wildly popular romance printed in Spain in 1508, Amadis of Gaul. Composers and poets reimagined it for opera houses and bookshelves, but the core tale all but announces its Celtic DNA. A king of Gaula, better read as Wales, loves a Breton princess. Their secret child is launched on water and rescued by a kindly knight. The boy grows into a formidable hero known as Beltenbros, wins his beloved through ordeals on an enchanted island, and fathers a radiant heir. Illicit birth, water passage, fosterage, a god name turned epithet, trial and reward, fertility and succession. These are the building blocks of Celtic royal myth, resurfacing in late medieval dress far from their original shore. Behind that diffusion stands the great engine of medieval storytelling, the matter of Britain, the Arthurian world, which gathered and reworked Irish and Welsh motifs. Fenian episodes echo in scenes where Arthur battles giants, witches, and monstrous beasts much as Fionn mac Cumhaill does. Tristan and Isolde, almost certainly rooted in Cornish tradition, finds a close Irish counterpart in the pursuit of Dearmaid and Grain. The hunt through empty forests, the perilous quest, the testing of love in wild places. These themes tie the British and Gaelic cycles together, showing conversation rather than isolation between traditions. Celtic seafaring belongs as much to imagination as to logbook, yet voyage tales became one of the tradition's most powerful languages. Islands that rise and sink, shores where this world touches the next, glassy seas and crystal lands. The literature is saturated with marshes, fords, estuaries, and tidal paths where land and water constantly exchange roles. Manannán mac Lir, the sea magician, can turn the waves into a meadow, so a boat glides over treetops and orchards under its prow. In such a worldview, a westward crossing might lead to Avalon or to Tir na Nog, the blessed isles where sorrow and death fall away. Irish storytellers distinguished between adventures and voyages, but even they allowed the categories to blur. Bran mac Fable sails after a silver-branched summons, meets the charioteer of the sea who sees flowers where mortals see foam, and reaches laughing and women's isles where time dilates. He returns to an Ireland that no longer remembers him, and a companion who steps ashore crumbles to dust. Other narratives Christianize the same pattern. The wee Cora, once church robbers, cast away their oars as penance and let Providence choose their course. Snedgus and Macriagla follow men set adrift in coracles and find them living sinless among scriptural figures on a radiant island. Maelduin, warned to take a precise crew, is joined by 3 foster brothers and so upsets the tally. The voyage that follows is a pageant of wonders: glass bridges, color-changing sheep, flaming swine, shouting birds, and an island realm divided into shining quarters for kings, queens, warriors, and maidens. The later legend of Brendan the Navigator recasts the marvels with a monastic gloss, a whale serving as an Easter altar, visions of torment and restoration, and a saint shepherding souls across an oceanic liturgy. From these visionary seas, the tradition moves into hard history as Irish monasticism spreads learning throughout Britain and the continent. Exiled kings sought sanctuary at Iona. Northumbria's Oswald turned to Ireland for a bishop and received Aidan of Lindisfarne. Missionaries trained in Irish houses converted Frisians, founded Luxeuil in old Celtic Gaul, and built Bobbio in Italy. Around these centers, a school of art married Irish, Pictish, and Anglo-Saxon forms into manuscripts of astonishing grace. The Book of Durrow, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Kells, survivors of a larger beauty partly lost to Viking fire. Their intricate pages carried not just scripture, but a visual theology of knots, beasts, and light that still speaks across time. Ireland's later story turns on conquest, plantation, and resistance. Norse traders left towns and loanwords. Norman lords often went native and learned Gaelic. The real rupture came with Tudor and Stuart rule, when religion sharpened political division. Ulster saw deliberate settlement by British Protestants after Gaelic leaders fled. Rebellions and reprisals hardened lines, and the Battle of the Boyne fixed a divided future, Catholic South and Protestant North, under laws that shut Catholics out of land, office, and learning. Georgian Dublin gained its graceful streets even as the older Gaelic culture was pressed to the margins. Estates replanted and houses reshaped the countryside. The potato, introduced by English influence, slowly displaced earlier grains and set the stage for catastrophe. By 1801, 5 million people lived in Ireland. By 1840, 8 million. Then blight struck. Between 1845 and 1847, hunger killed 1 million, mostly the very young and the very old, and 1 million more fled. Over the next century, millions left for America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain's industrial cities. The famine fused Catholic identity with national aspiration, shifting the rhetoric of unity from Presbyterian Belfast towards the devastated southern counties. Poor harvests in the late 1870s reignited emigration and lit the land war, which shattered the Catholic landed class and ensured that the later struggle for independence would be led from below rather than by traditional elites. Out of these pressures arose home rule demands and, eventually, insurrection. Charles Stewart Parnell, an aristocrat turned national tribune, helped organize the Land League and accelerated reform. The Easter Rising claimed a republic in 1916. The long, uneven road to political autonomy followed, though Ulster remained outside the new state. As Yeats wrote, the country had changed utterly. And yet beneath every change, the old inheritance continued to flow. The myths of kingship and quest, the arts of page and song, the habit of seeing another world just beyond the horizon, an inheritance restless enough to wander, resilient enough to endure. Scotland endured a tragedy much like Ireland's, though its sorrow came not from the potato, but from the sheep. In the late 19th century, Catherine McPhee of Uist recalled with pain how entire villages were swept away. Families were forced from their ancestral lands, their homes emptied and burned. The strongest men were tied up on the docks of Loch Boisdale and thrown aboard ships like livestock, while the officers and police stood guard behind them. Hunger, disease, and exile followed. Those who survived made their way to the crowded streets of Glasgow or across the ocean to Canada, while others perished before ever reaching a new shore. Donald MacLeod of Sutherland also bore witness to the same suffering. In his letters later collected under the title Gloomy Memories, he described how the proud Highlanders, once free and content, were torn from their homes in a storm of cruelty and greed. Smoke darkened the sky as centuries-old cottages were burned to the ground. The descendants of warriors who had once fought for Scottish freedom at Bannockburn and Culloden were reduced to beggars, stripped of dignity and land, forced to seek refuge in distant lands. This great tragedy became known as the Highland Clearances. After the Act of Union in 1707 bound Scotland to England, the balance of power shifted southward. The failed Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745 crushed Highland independence, and after the final defeat at Culloden, the British Army imposed brutal punishments on the Highland clans. Even the playing of bagpipes was outlawed, giving rise to the haunting vocal rhythms known as puirt a bhul, mouth music, still sung in Scotland today. But the true devastation came later, with the arrival of a new and profitable breed of sheep, the Great Cheviot. The old clan system had collapsed, and the Highland nobility, once proud of their Celtic lineage, sought to imitate the wealth of English landowners. Greedy for profit, they replaced people with sheep. In 1792, remembered as Bliadna nan Caurach, the Year of the Sheep, the transformation began. The Highland glens were emptied, homes destroyed, and thousands driven away so that flocks could graze freely. The Black Watch Regiment was even used to crush local resistance, much of it led by women who refused to abandon their homes. Agents like James Locke, serving powerful landlords, regarded the Highlanders as backward and expendable. By the mid-1800s, ships crowded with exiles left Scottish shores for America, Canada, and Australia. When the Crimean War broke out in 1854, recruiters returned to Scotland seeking soldiers, but the men mocked them, saying bitterly, "You chose sheep over men. Let sheep defend you now." Though the clans were broken, their names and symbols endured. Even as some chiefs adopted the airs and fashions of English nobility, wearing extravagant tartans, plumes, and polished brass buttons, the ancient clan identities survived. Names like Chisholm, MacLeod, and Campbell continued to bind descendants across the world, keeping alive a sense of belonging that no clearance could destroy. In the 19th century, a revival of Celtic pride swept through the British Isles. Movements such as Young Ireland celebrated ancient heritage and inspired political awakening. Wales renewed its traditions through poetry and music at the Eisteddfod, while Cornish and Breton groups revived their own lost languages and customs. On the Isle of Man, the Manx Language Society fought to rescue their tongue from extinction. Henry Jenner's Handbook of the Cornish Language in 1904 marked the rebirth of a language thought to be gone forever. Writers like William Butler Yeats gave voice to this Celtic vision, a belief that Ireland, untouched by the feverish pace of the modern world, still carried the gift of spiritual vision. This romantic spirit appealed deeply to people searching for meaning beyond material success. For in Celtic belief, death was not an end, but a crossing, a journey to another, brighter world. Yet Celtic romanticism also brought distortions. Some sought to paint the Celts as noble dreamers, denying the harsher truths of their past, the wars, the sacrifices, the violence. Forgeries like James Macpherson's so-called Ossian poems misled even great scholars, while later storytellers and filmmakers reduced Celtic myth to shallow fantasy. Despite this, genuine fascination with Celtic culture continued to grow. shaping modern identities and national pride. By the end of the 20th century, the Celtic spirit had reawakened politically as well. Scotland voted overwhelmingly for devolution in 1997, restoring its own parliament for the first time in centuries, and Wales followed with its own measure of autonomy. Hopes even rose for eventual Scottish independence, 300 years after the Union that had taken it away. The Celtic legacy remains deeply woven into British life, in its art, music, tourism, and imagination. It speaks to something timeless, the yearning for connection, identity, and spiritual depth. That same longing explains why, when Princess Diana died in 1997, millions wept not just for a woman but for what she represented, the archetype of a queen chosen by destiny. To many, she embodied the ancient Celtic image of a monarch touched by the divine, beautiful, compassionate, and fated to bring light and tragedy in equal measure. Her death seemed to awaken an old memory, the people's need for a ruler who is not merely human, but a symbol of their collective soul. The kings and queens of the Celtic world were not all wise or kind, but they shared a legacy that outlived their kingdoms. It was a vision of justice, courage, reverence for nature, and equality between men and women. They believed in fair judgment, in the sanctity of truth, and in facing adversity with strength and honor. Above all, they believed that life was a journey guided by unseen powers, a sacred path leading to Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. That belief, born in the mists of the ancient Highlands, still whispers today wherever people remember that they are children of the Celts.